It's a cold January evening in 1995, Beaumont, Texas. The kind of night where the quiet hum of the suburbs feels almost too still. Inside her cozy townhouse, 31-year-old Mary Catherine Edwards, a beloved elementary school teacher, prepares for what should have been a normal weekend. She had graded papers earlier that day, maybe planned lessons for her fifth graders, kids who adored her smile and her kindness. But by the next morning, that warmth would vanish forever. When her parents couldn't reach her, they drove to her home. What they found inside shattered the town of Beaumont. Mary was in her bathtub, handcuffed, submerged, gone. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken glass. No missing valuables. Whoever did this, she trusted them enough to let them in. And here's the haunting part. The handcuffs used were police-grade, with traceable serial numbers, yet the trail led nowhere. No suspects. No answers. No justice. For 26 years, her killer walked free, blending into everyday life, attending weddings, raising a family, pretending to be ordinary. Until science caught up. Until a strand of DNA whispered the truth. Because the man who killed Mary Catherine wasn't a stranger at all. He was someone who once stood beside her. As a groomsman, smiling at her wedding. This is the story of Mary Catherine Edwards, the teacher who lit up every room she entered, and the friend who hid a monster's heart behind a familiar face. Before she became a headline, Mary Catherine Edwards was simply known as Mary. A daughter, a sister, a friend, and one of the most beloved teachers in Beaumont, Texas. Born and raised in this tight-knit community, Mary Catherine carried herself with a mix of grace and quiet determination. She graduated from Beaumont High School, where her yearbook described her as the girl with the sunshine smile. Her classmates remembered how she was always the first to offer help, the one who stayed after school to decorate banners, or volunteer at events no one else wanted to do. After earning her degree in education, she returned home, because that's who she was. Loyal to her roots, devoted to her students. Mary taught at Price Elementary, where fifth graders adored her. Parents called her the teacher who could make any child believe they were special. She didn't just teach reading or math, she taught kindness, resilience, and confidence. She wrote in one of her journals, "I want my students to feel seen, because when I was their age, one teacher did that for me, and it changed everything." Her classroom was filled with color, hand-drawn rainbows on the walls, and little notes she left on her students' desks like, "I believe in you." Outside school, Mary had a simple but beautiful routine. She'd jog around her neighborhood every morning, waving at the same neighbors who still remember her smile today. She loved gardening. Her porch was lined with hanging ferns and pink begonias she watered every Saturday. And she was close to her parents, visiting them often for dinner, always calling her mom before bed to say, "I love you." But Mary also had dreams beyond the classroom. She wrote about wanting to get married again one day, to have a home filled with laughter and love. In her journal, she had once written, "I still believe in good people. I still believe in love." She had been married briefly years before, but it ended amicably. Her friends said she never let bitterness settle in her heart. She was pure, one friend remembered. She could find good in anyone. And that kindness, that unguarded trust, would be the very thing someone used against her. Because the person who walked through her front door that January night was someone she once thought she could trust. But back then, Mary didn't know she was being watched. That her generosity had drawn the eyes of a man who never truly let her go. Late in the fall of 1994, as autumn faded into winter in Beaumont, Texas, whispers began to live beneath the surface of Mary Catherine Edwards's quiet world, subtle signs of something shifting, but nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms. Yet, her mother, Mary Ann Edwards, recalled one Sunday evening in November. Her daughter, fresh from work, sat across the kitchen table with a thoughtful look in her eyes. Mary Catherine said, "Mama, I feel like I'm being watched." Her voice wasn't trembling, more tentative, as though she was testing the words in the air. Mary Ann remembered offering reassurance. "It's probably just nerves, or the dark getting to you." Mary Catherine shook her head and gently replied, "No. It's different." That was the first moment, a crack in her usual quiet confidence. At school, Mary was still the image of bright devotion. Classroom decorated in warm tones, children lining up, sharing their weekend stories, she greeting each one with a hug and a plate of brownies. But outside of the school walls, friends noticed a change. In her journal, she had written late one November night, "Some nights I lie in bed and listen for a sound that isn't there, but I still hear it." No one thought much of it at the time. Mary Catherine had always been expressive, but this felt like more than reflection. Then came the odd phone call. In December, Mary received a message from an old high school acquaintance, a man from her past she hadn't spoken to in years. The voice on the other end said nothing but asked, "Do you remember me?" She politely said yes. He didn't say much else. The call ended. She didn't mention it to her parents or her twin sister Allison. It was just weird. Friends later recalled she began locking her front door earlier than usual. She started closing the blinds at dusk. None of it alarmed family, she was cautious, that's all. But what they didn't know was that those small actions were the rare moments that broke through her gracious trust that would one day become her undoing. Meanwhile, investigators, though still grinding through evidence, were quietly puzzled by the clues from the crime scene. At the time the case first made headlines, authorities listed the cause of death as drowning. But seasoned investigators later wondered, based on bruising and body positioning, if it was suffocation by compression. And there was that lingering detail: police-grade Smith & Wesson handcuffs found fastened behind Mary's back. The absence of forced entry. The intact front door. The quiet townhouse. In the early winter nights of 1994 to 95, these details didn't yet scream danger. They whispered it. Mary's mother, Mary Ann, often found herself glancing at her daughter's driveway in the evenings. She expected Mary Catherine to pull in at 6:15 p.m., as usual, maybe call her before heading inside. But on one December evening, Mary Ann could not remember the exact date. The car pulled in at 6:43 p.m. She stood at the window for a moment. Something felt off. Mary Catherine emerged, locked the door earlier than normal, and walked to the house without that familiar wave. Mary Ann later described the feeling as a cold, sudden hush. In the months before the tragedy, Mary Catherine changed her routines. She stopped leaving her car unlocked, as she'd always done in her safe neighborhood. Her mail piled up one week because she forgot to enter her code at the postbox. She started saying she was just tired when pressed about any trouble. Her friends thought it was just work stress, another teacher's heavy load. Her mother believed it was more. But the real crack? It came one night in early January, when Mary Catherine helped decorate for a coworker's party until 9 p.m. She left gracefully, laughing and smiling, assuring everyone she'd stop by the next week. That was the last time anyone remembers seeing her with that brightness. That's the last warm wave. Because before the month was out, her life would end. And the storm inside her quiet town was about to break. The signs were there, scattered, soft, almost easy to dismiss. But now, as winter settled and a Saturday evening approached, those signs would become the evidence of something far darker. Something that would change everything. It began like any weekend night in Beaumont, Texas, a town where the streetlights flicker on early, neighbors nod hello on their way to dinner, and 31-year-old schoolteacher Mary Catherine Edwards returned to her townhouse at ease. She had wrapped up grading papers, a light flickering in her bedroom, and the quiet assurance of a familiar routine. At 9:10 p.m., her twin sister Allison recalls Mary Catherine calling from work. "Just left Price Elementary, heading home. Be safe." By 9:45 p.m., Mary Catherine's parents expected the usual phone call. But the line went unanswered. The voicemail clicked. Her car, parked out front, exactly where she always left it, offered no hint of alarm. Past midnight, in the darkness of that quiet townhouse, something moved. An unfamiliar shadow saw the front lights off, the locked door, the unbothered dog asleep in the yard. Someone entered, not forced but invited or trusted, because investigators would later determine there were no signs of forced entry. Around 1:14 a.m., the crime scene was frozen in time. Mary Catherine lay in her bathtub, her body partially submerged in cold water, her hands bound behind her back with police-grade Smith & Wesson handcuffs. She had been sexually assaulted. Later forensic review would suggest her cause of death was likely entrapment asphyxiation, not drowning as first reported. When Mary Catherine's mother, Mary Ann Edwards, dialed 911 that early Saturday, her voice trembled. "We came over here and found her. Please send someone over." In that moment, the safe facade of Park Meadow Drive shattered. A vibrant life, one bustling with promise and warmth, now lay cold and lifeless under the flicker of a towel rack light. The neighborhood remained as quiet as ever. Streets sprayed by lamplight, a dog barking once then silence, no sirens yet, no flashing lights. The only trace of evil? The evidence left inside. Bound wrists, a familiar home, a trust betrayed. And for nearly 3 decades, the questions would outnumber the answers. What made her so vulnerable? Who could walk away from a scene like this, untouched and free? The trail was cold, but somewhere the killer believed he'd gotten away with it. But police-grade handcuffs don't stay hidden forever. Because in the small town of Beaumont, darkness may linger, but science eventually shines a light. For years after the January night, life in Beaumont seemed to resume, as if the screaming shadows had been tucked away under someone's rug. But the case had not closed. Behind that facade of normalcy, someone was carefully reconstructing their life. Someone whose silence would be their greatest weapon. Investigators returned to that crime scene date and again stared at the clues. The police-grade Smith & Wesson handcuffs that bound Mary Catherine's wrists behind her back. The lack of forced entry, meaning her killer walked in unchallenged. And the degree of planning, clean scene, minimal DNA left, as though the killer had rehearsed his exit. One early lead centered on a former boyfriend cleared by DNA. But it wasn't enough. Meanwhile, the killer kept his routine. He showed up at high school reunions. He smiled in photograph. He attended the very wedding in which Mary Catherine had been a bridesmaid. Nobody suspected him. He wore respectability like armor. His ex-wife remembered oddities. The handcuffs in his car. The billy club he kept by their bed. Objects meant to protect or to dominate. When Mary Catherine's parents called after her death, he responded with polite condolences. No tears. No confusion. Just quiet. Detectives saw it as one more sign of the mask he wore so well, the mask of one of the good guys. He denied even knowing her. "No, sir. Never dated her. I didn't even go in her house." These denials stacked like bricks in a wall. But investigators were chipping away. Behind scenes outside the courthouse, a plan was taking shape. Files pulled. Evidence boxes dusted. DNA samples kept cold. Cold case investigators quietly revived the file. The handcuffs, the water trails, the bruise patterns, the belongings left undisturbed. This was more than a crime scene. They were watching someone who thought they were invisible. And he almost was. The killer stayed ahead. He moved out of state, changed addresses, adopted new routines, stayed out of the spotlight. But the handcuffs never broke. They remained catalogued under evidence tag 95E23, locked but never dormant. Years passed, with phone calls unanswered, followed by empty interviews. While DNA hits none. The story became legend. Her death was like a ghost story told around a campfire, a detective later said. The killer, meanwhile, kept doing what he did. Sundays at church, high school reunion roles, a man known for organizing class photos. No one saw the danger. But danger had seen Mary Catherine. She wrote in her journal, "I feel like I'm being watched. I don't know who yet." And she locked her door at 8:47 p.m. for the first time in years. Just weeks later, she was gone. The lies multiplied. Alibis given, timelines shifted, stories rewritten. The investigators waited. Because they knew, the truth hides in details that can't be erased. And the most incriminating object of all went unnoticed for decades. To the man who believed he'd covered his tracks, the very handcuffs used on Mary Catherine were his undone badge. When the day came, when he was placed in those exact cuffs, investigators felt it not as triumph, but as justice known. For more than 2 decades the file sat in a cardboard box. Photos curled at the edges, reports yellowing, witness statements stacked and annotated. The evidence was preserved with care. Swabs sealed, photographs logged, the police-grade handcuffs catalogued as Exhibit 95E23. But for 26 years, the science of the day could not find a name to put beside the crime. Then, a quiet revolution began in forensic labs across the country. Genetic genealogy, the technique that threads crime scene DNA through public family trees built from consumer DNA sites, started solving the unsolvable. By 2018, detectives in Beaumont knew they had one of those cases, a single preserved DNA profile that might finally speak. In April 2020, the stored DNA from Mary Catherine's crime scene was sent to Othram, a Houston-area lab that specializes in the new kind of testing. The lab produced familial matches that didn't point to a single person. They opened doors. From those first matches a family tree began to grow. But it wasn't a neat, tidy tree. It ballooned, sideways, up, down, until it filled Detective Aaron Llewellyn's screen with names, dates, marriages, births. Nearly 7,500 entries. It was a jigsaw without the box cover, overwhelming and maddening. That's when they called in a specialist. Shara LaPointe, known to some as the Gene Hunter, had a reputation for turning massive messy trees into focused lead. Working with Detective Tina Llewellyn late into the night, Shara traced branches into southwest Louisiana, into Cajun families around Kaplan. The DNA signals all pointed in that cultural and geographic direction. Piece by piece they trimmed the forest. Tina read Mary Catherine's journals for any French or Cajun names. They looked for people who lived in Beaumont, people with ties to schools, people who might plausibly have known a teacher. They searched high school rosters, marriage records, obituaries, Facebook posts. It was painstaking work, hours and hours of it. One night, Shara hit pay dirt. A Thibodeau family in Beaumont had 2 sons who'd gone to Forest Park High, the same school Mary attended. That narrowed the field dramatically. The tree now pointed to 2 brothers, Michael and Clayton Foreman. The hairs on the back of Detective Llewellyn's neck stood up when he ran Clayton's name. Why? Because decades earlier, in 1981, a woman had accused a young Clayton of binding her and sexually assaulting her. He'd been convicted, given probation and a fine, at a time when sex offender registries and DNA collection were not what they are now. He had never been put into a DNA database for that offense. Detectives moved with the care of people who know how tenuous these cases can be. They began to assemble corroboration, addresses, work histories, travel records. Clayton, by then, was not in Beaumont. He had moved out of state. He was living in Reynoldsburg, Ohio, working as an Uber driver. He had blended into a new life. But DNA doesn't care about reinvention. It waits. To secure a direct match, law enforcement needed a sample from Clayton himself. They used a classic technique, the trash pull. Officers surveilled his home, collected refuse that he had discarded, then sent it to the lab. The samples were run at the Texas DPS crime lab. When the numbers came back, the statistical probability of the DNA belonging to Clayton Foreman was astronomically conclusive, a number reported by the team as something like 461 septillion to 1. In other words, overwhelming. For detectives, that was the sound of the final lock clicking into place. They had a scientific anchor to everything they'd unearthed. They didn't rush. They planned a careful approach. Ranger Brandon Bess and Detective Aaron Llewellyn flew to Ohio, coordinated with local law enforcement, and created a ruse, a missing purse from an Uber ride, to get Clayton into a sheriff's office voluntarily. On April 29, 2021, 26 years after Mary Catherine's death, they sat across from a man who had once been a friend of the family and asked him to talk. He came in and answered questions. He didn't immediately crumble. He didn't confess. But when detectives told him why they were there, when they explained the DNA, the family trees, the trash pull, the gravity of what they held became clear. The evidence was scientific, meticulous, and immovable. Even after the arrest, investigators continued to gather context. They interviewed old friends. Diana Coe, the bride for whom Mary Catherine had been a bridesmaid, replayed memories of the past. The way Clayton had been close to police memorabilia, the handcuffs hung in his car, the evasive explanations when his earlier sexual assault charge came up before their wedding. In hindsight, small details that once seemed odd formed a pattern. But it was the quiet, modern miracle of genetic genealogy coupled with old-fashioned detective work, interviews, trash pulls, travel records, that finally closed the loop. A DNA profile that had sat mute for a quarter-century became the key that unlocked a man's hidden past. The case that had once been a ghost story around campfires in Beaumont now had a suspect with a trail that led straight to him. In the halls of the Jefferson County Prosecutor's Office, the file was no longer a sad, unsolved mystery. It was proof that persistence and patience, combined with science, could, at last, offer a measure of justice. For Mary Catherine's family, the long dark wait had ended. For the community, the man who had stood at weddings and birthdays, who had worn familiarity like armor, was now facing the only thing he could not elude: the truth. After Clayton Foreman's arrest, the wheels of justice turned again in Jefferson County, where the story of Mary Catherine Edwards had always been part grief and part unanswered question. But now, for the first time in more than 2 decades, a courtroom would bear witness to the full weight of evidence, the forensic science, the memories, the truth that had long waited to be heard. The prosecution's case was built methodically. They began by laying out the crime from January 1995. The scene, the handcuffs, the lack of forced entry, the assault. Then they introduced the DNA match. The genetic genealogy tree pointing to Foreman, the trash pull that secured his DNA, and the statistical probability linking him definitively to the crime scene. Witnesses had long passed away or moved, but Mary Catherine's journals, her friends, and that bridesmaid photo became silent witnesses themselves. One of the most emotional moments came when Mary Catherine's mother, Mary Ann Edwards, took the stand. Standing fragile but firm, she recounted her daughter's voice the night she said she felt watched, the Sunday Mary had left with a heavier heart than usual, and how her daughter's laughter had once filled their modest home. She looked directly across at Foreman, seated, expressionless, and said, "They stole her life. But they can't steal her memory." The silence that followed was deeper than any gasp. The defense, in turn, questioned chain of custody, possible contamination, or lab error. They acknowledged the genealogy methods but argued it was circumstantial. They hinted at alternative explanations. Someone else entering that night, someone with law enforcement knowledge. Recall the unanswered questions about handcuffs. The jury watched every exchange, every expression, every shift in body language. But the evidence held firm. The judge admitted the DNA evidence under Texas standard. He instructed the jury that they must consider whether the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Foreman caused Mary Catherine's death, not necessarily how. The instructions were precise, fair, leaving the ultimate judgment to human conscience. Deliberations began. The jury retired. Outside the courtroom, family and community members sat waiting with raw hope and pent-up sorrow. Reporters filed rebuttal posts and theory articles. The air felt electric. After hours that stretched into the evening, the jury returned. Their faces grave, their papers stiff. The judge asked for the foreperson to speak. "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." In those two simple words lay decades of grief, the sharp edge of resolution, and the echo of one woman's life restored, at least in part, to meaning. The courtroom erupted with silent tears, chokebacks, the quiet exhalation of those who had waited too long. Foreman remained impassive, though his lips quivered ever so slightly as the life sentence, life without parole, was read. The gavel came down, justice. Mary Catherine's family stood in the gallery. Mary unclosed her eyes, whispered, "Thank you." Allison touched her sister's photograph. The children of her former classroom, now adults, sat in back rows, remembering how she had touched them. No reprieve, no appeal. The verdict held. In that moment, a community exhaled. The woman who had been taken under mysterious darkness was finally recognized, honored, vindicated. They didn't just sentence a man, they lifted a long silence. In that courtroom, justice was finally named, and her name, Mary Catherine Edwards, was spoken again not as a victim, but as someone whose light refused to be dimmed. When the final gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, silence returned to Beaumont, but not the kind born of grief. This silence felt lighter, as though the air had finally learned how to breathe again. For over 2 decades, Mary Catherine Edwards' story had been a haunting chapter in local history, a beautiful teacher found lifeless in her own home, a case that lingered in files and hearts alike. But her legacy was never about the way she died. It was, and will always be, about the way she lived. Her former students still speak her name with warmth. One recalls how she used to tape little handwritten notes to their desks before big exams. "You're stronger than you think." Another remembers her humming quietly as she graded papers, always in rhythm with the world around her. To her friends, she was the steady one, a listener, a confidant, a quiet force of kindness. In the years since her death, her case has become a landmark in the power of perseverance and the evolution of forensic science. It showed that truth can outlast time, that even decades later, the smallest trace, a strand of DNA, can speak when no one else can. Her story joined a growing movement of cases solved through genetic genealogy, inspiring investigators across the country to revisit cold cases once thought unsolvable. But beyond science, there's something deeper, something human. Mary's mother, Mary Ann, once said in an interview that she prayed every night for closure, but also for understanding. She said, "I wanted to know that people still cared, that she wasn't forgotten." And they didn't forget. Every news update, every court date, every whisper of progress. It reminded the community that justice delayed isn't justice denied. Mary Catherine's life, though brief, left ripples that never stopped moving. She taught through her compassion, and now, through her story, she continues to teach the world about hope, patience, and faith in truth. The case also reshaped how small-town America views justice. It reminded investigators that even quiet crimes in quiet neighborhoods deserve the same relentless pursuit of truth as any headline case. It reminded families never to give up asking questions. And it reminded all of us that behind every statistic there is a person, someone who laughed, loved, and dreamed. In Mary's old school, they planted a tree in her memory, a small oak beside the playground. It said that every spring the children hang notes on its branches. "Be kind. Don't give up. I love you, Miss Edwards." Mary Catherine Edwards' story isn't just about a crime. It's about a promise that no matter how much time passes, truth will find its way home. Like, comment, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories. Your support keeps us going.